Vietnam has been recognized as one of 16 countries with highest biodiversity in the world, with about 7,500 microorganism species, 20,000 species of terrestrial and aquatic plants, and 10,500 terrestrial animal species. Under the sea, there are over 7,000 invertebrate species, about 2,500 fish species, and approximately 50 species of sea snakes, sea turtles, and marine mammals. The country currently has 173 protected areas, including 33 national parks and 66 natural reserves. 9 areas have been recognized as World Biosphere Reserve with a total area of more than 4.2 million hectares.
Hello and welcome to Talk Vietnam. Over the past decade, Vietnam has gained world recognition over its policies and actions on wildlife conservation, particularly those listed in the Red Book. Notably, Vietnam is rated A by CITES for its efforts in endangered wildlife protection. Such efforts, coupled with those on ending wildlife trade and consumption, are becoming more and more vital in the context that the world has seen over the last 30 years a rise in emerging infectious disease in humans. And of these, over 70% are zoonotic, meaning it jumped from animals to humans, likely as a result of our increasing interaction with wildlife. Let's discuss this topic with our two guests of Talk Vietnam this week, Ms. Bùi Thị Hà, Vice Director of Education for Nature Vietnam, ENV, and Dr. Benjamin Rawson, Conservation and Program Development Director of Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF in Vietnam. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. So how far have scientists in the world have gone in their research in the possible links between COVID-19 epidemic and wildlife trade and consumption?
It hasn't been proven 100% yet, but I can tell you what we do know. And what we know is coronaviruses have reservoirs in wild animals. We know that other diseases that are very similar, other coronaviruses such as SARS, MERS, have come from wildlife through these sometimes intermediate wildlife hosts, from bats to pangolins, bats to civets, in the case of SARS, for example, and into people. And what we know is that it comes from a wildlife market. We also know that wildlife trade amplifies these pathogens. When you get a whole lot of animals in poor health, they shed virus, you put them all together, blood, feces, urine, they're then butchered in close proximity to humans. This is the perfect environment for disease to jump from wildlife to humans.
A report by World Health Organizations also stated that 70% of the infectious disease that in the last 30 years was zoonotic, meaning that it was sourced from animals.
Right. So does it mean that if we can stop wildlife trafficking and consumption, it will help prevent the recurrence of a similar pandemic like COVID-19?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely is a contribution to reducing pandemic risk. There's no doubt about that.
How do you think COVID-19 has helped people to act differently? And how is the message of protecting the biodiversity has been put forward since COVID-19 took place?
Wildlife conservation is often a fringe topic, right? It's not mainstream. It's considered, something that's nice to do, to save wildlife because wildlife's cute and nice to have. COVID-19 has really brought to the forefront our relationship with nature and the lack of balance between, humans and nature. What we have seen is, over the last 50, 60 years, large-scale loss of biodiversity. The Living Planet Index suggests a 68% decline in vertebrate populations. For some groups of animals, that's even worse. So for freshwater migratory fish, it's closer to 80% losses.
Wow.
Or if you look into our oceans with corals, with a 1.5 degree increase in global temperatures, that we would lose 70 to 90% of all corals.
I got this information that Vietnam ranks 16th in the world in terms of biodiversity. So can you help elaborate more on this?
Sure. Yeah, Vietnam is often credited as being one of the most biodiverse countries globally. As you know, Vietnam's very skinny, but it's also very long, so it covers a lot of latitudinal gradients, which means you have very diverse habitats here. From down in the Mekong Delta, the lowlands and the wetlands down there, up into the mountains of the central Annamites that border between Laos and Vietnam, and then further up into the limestone forests up in northern Vietnam. So it's a highly diverse number of habitats, and that's provided a place for many species to evolve.
And also Vietnam is also known as a hub of discoveries with new species and also with animals that once thought to be extinct, and now they found them in the forest of Vietnam. So what does this imply about the natural habitats of Vietnam?
Well, Vietnam historically, or even in terms of prehistory, has been a hotbed of evolution, if you like, especially in areas like central Vietnam in the central Annamites forests, where over time, as climatic changes have taken effect, forests have contracted and then expanded again. And this has allowed for evolutionary processes to occur there, and speciation, so large numbers of new species being created in those areas over millions of years. Some of these most interesting and unique species to Vietnam are found in this area, and some of them were discovered as recently as in the 1990s. For example, the sao la, large-antlered muntjac, and others which are unique to that area.
What helped them to move to Vietnam and live there?
Ultimately, protection is key. So we need to provide the space, the protected areas and the protected habitats for these species to survive in and be able to move through those landscapes.
Thanks to relentless efforts of the functional forces, wildlife has returned to their environment. A herd of rare gaurs listed in the Red Book of Vietnam and thought to be extinct was spotted in Cat Tien National Park.
Khu vực này là nó có sự di chuyển của 5 đàn bò, và trong đó có một con đực đi riêng lẻ. Bò tót thì nó sống theo 7 đàn, thường đàn ít nhất là nó khoảng từ 1 đến 3 con. Và đàn trung bình là từ 4 đến 12 con. Tháng vừa rồi thì cũng đã xác định đó là cái đàn bò 20 con nó đã đẻ được khoảng 2 cá thể. Cái lo lắng nhất của chúng tôi là hiện tại cái đàn bò này đang phát triển cũng khá là tốt, nhưng cái áp lực lớn nhất là cái nạn săn bắt, bắn trái phép. Tôi nghĩ là từ năm 2001 đến giờ, tôi nghĩ là đàn bò tót chắc chắn sẽ tăng, bởi vì một đàn bò nó khoảng 2-3 năm nó sẽ đẻ một lứa. Khi được nhìn thấy chúng ăn một cách tự nhiên, cảm giác mình đang được hòa vào cái thiên nhiên và cảm giác của mình đang được sống với chúng.
So Ben, what do you think about the in situ wildlife conservation? Maybe can you explain the definition
Sure.
of this?
In situ, basically in conservation for wildlife, there's basically two approaches. One is in situ and one is ex situ. In situ means to try and protect in place, that is animals in their native habitat. Ex situ is, the roles of zoos and rescue centres and captive breeding programs to try and preserve species which may be very rare or maybe need to be reintroduced into the wild after they've been bred.
I think like the in situ conservation will be like cheaper and more efficient rather than ex situ, because when I think about the cost like for ex situ conservation to reintroduce an animals to the wild, like it will take a lot of time, energies, technologies and everything to get it done.
I completely agree. You see some countries, Western countries, developed countries, now having to deal with some of these issues. So in terms of reintroduction of animals, wolves and bears are examples. These are incredibly costly programs.
Exactly.
You know, the cost of reintroducing tiger to Vietnam would be in the tens of millions of dollars to even get a few animals into the wild. The costs, as you say, of maintaining our biodiversity, you know, our natural heritage here is much, much cheaper. It's much more efficient.
So with that, can you please help introduce some role models that in wildlife conservation that maybe Vietnam can take the experience from?
With ENV, we run a toll-free hotline, 1-800-1522. Remember that.
Okay, we will.
For that number, so every member of the public, when they see a wildlife have been, you know, whether it is the macaque or, you know, any wildlife have been sold, they can just report to the hotline numbers. And then, you know, we have our case officers that will work hand in hand with the law enforcement agency to address those wildlife crime reports. And then we will inform the member of the public of the result so that we can encourage them to, you know, participate more in wildlife protections. And with that model, we have recorded more than 18,000 of cases since 2005, and many of them had come from the public.
I think there's lots, and I think a lot of them are just everyday people, to be honest. And I think it comes back to what Ha's saying is that, you know, anyone can, you know, be a warrior, can fight for wildlife. For example, visiting a community in Quang Nam province, living, you know, in the forest, and some of the younger people there got together, they formed a wildlife conservation group, and then they went around to the villages that they called their homes to work with you know, local hunters and the local people to try and convince them that maybe hunting wasn't such a great idea. And they offered their own time and services in order to try and offset, you know, the loss that hunting might have caused for some of those families. For me, that was incredibly inspirational, and they just organised themselves. You know, local NGOs that deal with wildlife-related issues such as ENV, Wild Act, Pan Nature, and many others who work in difficult conditions, often with not much funding. And I think lastly, we also need to recognise Vietnam's ranger force, you know, especially those that are working inside the protected areas in very difficult conditions. They're often away from their families for weeks at a time. The pay is not necessarily that good. The work is dangerous in terms of exposure to disease or accident or even violence.
According to CITES, wildlife trafficking brings about a huge annual profit and approximately up to $21 billion US. What story behind this shocking number?
I think like in the end, you know, the demand for wildlife is the driving factors behind the illegal trade. And once the demand still exists, the profit's still there, and people still like trading wildlife unless like we have like more, you know, appropriate and effective method to deter those behaviors.
I think with any illicit trade, it's very difficult to get a grip on the actual, you know, amount of money, because there's no one disclosing their bank accounts to say how much money is being moved around. But what is clear is that there's a huge amount of money, that this is a highly lucrative business for large-scale international groups of criminals. You know, it's only just under the trafficking in drugs, trafficking in arms, you know, trafficking in people. Right. And in some cases, they're the same groups that traffic these other items, right, or people. This is organised crime. And of course, there's many players, right? Everything from the consumer who thinks, oh, I'm just having a, you know, this necklace made out of ivory, for example. It seems really nice. My wife might like it, you know, and all the way down to, you know, local people who may, you know, just be hunting a few animals to sell to some middleman who goes around and collects wildlife. They're small players, but in a much larger system, criminal system, which is basically stripping the world of its wildlife for profit.
So how are wildlife crime in Vietnam are being treated?
depending on the species or the protection level of this species and the amounts of the animals that confiscated. So the punishment for wildlife crime can be ranged from administrative punishment of up to 500 million Vietnam dong to criminal punishments of up to 15 years in prison. So this is the new punishment bracket under the new penal code that had just came into effect since 2018, and a substantial increase comparing to the punishment bracket under the older penal code, which is only the maximum of 7 years in prison for wildlife crime.
If I myself a consumer and I have that ivory necklace, would I go to jail for that?
Depend on the weight of that necklace. If it's from 2 kilograms, you can get of course like criminal punishment. Criminal punishment, not only jail time, but maybe criminal monetary punishment,
right,
or suspended sentence probation kind of punishment. Or if you just only have one tiger canine necklace, it will definitely a criminal offense, no matter what weight it is. So some very simple crimes that people don't even think it's a crime, but it actually can make them go to jail for that. This criminal punishment can be compared to other countries that I don't really see other countries that have that high punishment for wildlife crime like what we already have. I also see the law enforcement agencies are more responsive to a wildlife report by the public.
Those who illegally deliver, store and sell products from wild animals will face a sentence of 15 years, a fine of up to $645,000 and other punishments. Vietnam's fierce efforts in protecting wild animals have been highly appreciated. At the Đình Vũ Port border gate in Hải Phòng City, this 20-foot container was declared to customs as delivering wood imported from Apapa, Nigeria. However, it was detected as storing 500 kilograms of ivory and more than 1.5 tons of pangolin scales. These illegal products were carefully hidden behind 2 layers of wood at the back of the container. All these goods are on the list of prohibited items of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES.
Các đối tượng là thường xuyên từ chối nhận hàng hoặc là khai báo gian dối nguồn hàng, và khi đã phát hiện bắt giữ thì tìm mọi cách để chạy tội, để chống đối lại lực lượng thực thi pháp luật.
Over the past 2 years, Vietnam has caught 153 cases of selling rhino horn and ivory in large scale, seized and destroyed more than 20 tons of these goods. Save Vietnam's wildlife said between 2018 and 2019, the number of pangolins preserved by this center from wildlife trade in Vietnam has increased from 300 to 500. With these achievements, Vietnam is ranked A by the world's CITES in efforts to protect endangered species.
Việt Nam cũng đã được đánh giá là một trong những nước có cái cam kết rất là mạnh mẽ cái việc thực thi có hiệu quả, và chính phủ Việt Nam thì cũng đã ban hành hệ thống các cái văn bản quy phạm pháp luật, trong đó đã nội luật khá là toàn diện. Với cái vai trò là một thành viên của Công ước CITES, chắc chắn là chúng ta cũng phải quyết liệt hơn nữa để chúng ta có thể triệt phá được các cái đường dây buôn bán thực vật hoang dã.
In Vietnam, other wildlife animals such as turtles, birds or snakes have also been illegally traded. The authorities have detected and arrested the violators.
So, what do you think about the misunderstanding in Vietnam about wildlife products?
So in Vietnam, wildlife has been widely used for different purposes. Some people think that rhino horn, for example, is a magic medicines that can cure cancer. Bear bile is the same thing, or tiger bone glue can help to treat bone ailments and others related issue. People also believe that having tiger's paw or a bear claw can, bring good luck to the wearer. Even though, like, sometimes I joke with my friend that the animals couldn't protect themselves, so how can they protect us? They bring good luck for us. And, you know, ivory have been used for decorative purposes. And wildlife meat is not only a delicacy, but also considers have to improve health in general. So, I mean, like, there are so many misconceptions around the topic, and even though there's no scientific base for that, but the deep cultural belief still drive them to consume wildlife. And I think, like, it's very obvious that we don't need to kill an elephant to just have a jewelry, or we don't need to extract bear bios, make the bear miserable, when we have many others alternative and even more effective alternative. Why do we harm the animals to have that?
Some people believe in wildlife farming because of at least the following 3 reasons. First, it is an alternative to improve local livelihoods. Second, it supplies the market with domesticated wildlife products, and that will in return result in a decrease in the hunting of wildlife because you already have the domestic one. And thirdly, it supports conservation efforts by acting as a source of supplementing or reintroducing populations. So what do you think about this opinion?
I think, like, wildlife farming have been promoting in Vietnam, and I think like other part of the country, like, for the reason that you have been mentioned. But for us, like, we think that wildlife farming may pose a potential risk to wildlife conservation if we don't have a clear management system to control the issue. It takes you time, like, to raise an animal, like, from a cub to reach the size that you can sell that animal. For some turtles, hard-shell turtles, I think, like, it takes, like, even 8 years to reach that size. When it is just easy for you to hire a hunter and come into the forest to get you that turtles, to get you the tiger, to get you the bears. At that point, the farm can just only be a cover for you to launder the wildlife through through that legal facilities, you know. And the other thing is that it also stimulates the demand for wildlife. So we should not allow the farming of endangered species. Meanwhile, we can allow the farming of others, more common species that are viable for farming.
What do you think, Ben?
If you look at wild pig, for example, so I would disagree with you. I don't think it's a good idea to have wild pig farming. And the reason for that is the demand in Vietnam for wildlife is for wildlife. It's not for farmed wildlife. It's for wildlife. Right. It's because it's considered clean and fresh
and rare
and strong and rare.
Yeah.
And there's a secondary issue here as well, beyond this. Wild animals tend to have reservoirs of diseases. Right. And as we know from COVID-19, and if you have animals leaking from the wild into the farms, what you have is an opportunity for disease spillover.
So this is a question to both of you. What would you say to those who still believe that wildlife animals can be raised as pets?
I think both I and Ben, we just say, like, wildlife is not pet. And if you love an animal, just leave them in the natural habitat that they belong to. If, like, every one of us, like, thinking like them, so each one of us have a wildlife pet. Like, I have a macaque, you have, you know, whatever, a loris, for example. So how many wildlife will suffer?
People don't know often how to feed and look after these animals, right? They're wild animals. They have their own social requirements in terms of the social groups that they live in, potentially for things like macaques. They have their own dietary requirements. So, for example, leaf-eating monkeys might come into the trade, someone buys it, but they have very, very diverse requirements in terms of the leaves that they eat. People feed them rice and bananas. The bacteria in their stomach dies, so they can't digest cellulose, then they die.
Vietnam has established protected areas for wild elephants to help them reproduce and maintain their herds in an effort to conserve this highly endangered animal. However, this initiative is also facing many difficulties. The natural habitats of elephants in Vietnam are being seriously affected as forest areas have been decreasing. This image was taken by a group of staff from the Elephant Conservation Project at the Đắk Lắk Elephant Conservation Center. The third elephant in the project failed to give birth, even though every effort had been made.
Khi mà những cái cá thể voi này mang thai thì nó lại ở cái độ tuổi đã qua cái độ tuổi khả năng sinh sản tốt nhất. Bởi vì là hiện tại thì là đối với những cá thể voi mà có độ tuổi sinh sản tốt nhất là từ 13 cho đến 25 tuổi. Đấy. Ngoài cái lứa tuổi 25 tuổi ra thì phải những cái cá thể voi trước đó nó đã sinh sản rồi. Thì như vậy là cái lứa tuổi cao hơn cái lứa tuổi 25 tuổi thì nó còn có khả năng sinh sản được. Còn đường này voi của chúng ta là đã hơn 30 năm, chưa có trường hợp nào sinh sản.
According to the center's statistics, this area is currently being monitored with about 5 herds in the wild, including about 100 more scattered around the Vietnam-Cambodia border area, one of the largest groups in the country. But their habitats are also threatened by illegal forest exploitation, and the quality of forest is declining due to the many fires. In Đắk Lắk province, the population of elephants is quite large. However, most of them are too old.
Khi bắt tay vào cái đề tài nghiên cứu này, thì chúng tôi cùng với các bác sĩ thú y của trung tâm cũng như là các chuyên gia giúp đỡ các chuyên gia nước ngoài, cụ thể là từ vườn thú Hà Lan và trung tâm bảo tồn voi Thái Lan, và đã thực hiện một cái đề tài nghiên cứu và đã sàng lọc được, tới thời điểm này sàng lọc được 8 cá thể voi cái. Tuy lớn tuổi nhưng mà còn khả năng sinh sản, và kết quả là đã từ năm 2018 đến nay là có 3 voi cái mang thai và sinh con. Tuy nhiên thì cả 3 trường hợp này voi con sinh ra đều chết khi ra khỏi bụng mẹ.
The elephant is a unique culture symbol in Đắk Lắk province and in the Central Highlands region. However, according to experts, if no baby elephants are born in the next 10 years, the elephant population here will disappear. The staff of the Đắk Lắk Elephant Conservation Center is still doing its best to make the elephants reproduce. Hopefully, the first baby elephant will be born soon.
What can you say about the efforts of Vietnam in fighting against illegal wildlife trade in recent years?
I think Vietnam had come a long way in combating the illegal wildlife trade, and we had seen many indicators showing that we are on the right track. For example, the responsiveness from the law enforcement agency had been increased, and we also see that the bear farming issues in the past. In 2005, we have 4,300 bears that have been kept in the farms for bear bio extractions, and now the number had been dropped to just only about 400 bears. We also see that many wildlife traders, including the kingpin of the key criminal network, have been prosecuted and put in jail. So we had done a great job, and hopefully we will do better.
In terms of successes, I think there's some good movement in that direction. I think one of the big successes of the Vietnamese government has been the PFES law, Payment for Environmental Services. What this does is applies a tariff to hydropower and municipal water suppliers, and that money is then aggregated and then spent on forest protection in the watershed from where that resource comes from. Mm-hmm. So this is one of those approaches to valuing nature, saying, okay, these water services are not free.
Right.
Actually, there are associated, there's financial value in them. Let's identify what that financial value is and then pay it. Mm-hmm. And so that money then goes to forest protection to keep water flowing from those forests through those dams into your tap, when you turn on your tap at home for your water supplies, or when you turn on your light. That's a huge success, and that's bringing more capital into forest protection.
Right. So is there any major challenge in hindering the wildlife law enforcement in Vietnam?
Some problems that I can see is that many people still show their sympathy for the wildlife trader. As I mentioned earlier, they thought like they're just poor people trading wildlife. They doesn't know that there is a huge network under those people. And if we don't punish these small fish and try to get these small fish to tell us more about who behind them, so we cannot not address the root of the issue.
At the end of May, as rainy season starts, many plants sprout and grow. It's also the time for wild animals to come out of hiding places and seek for food, providing wildlife hunters with a great opportunity to set up traps and catch them all. Using the stick to check suspicious places, the Trap Terminators team spread out and started to work. With snares, they can cut off the strings with ease, but any snare or trap possesses deadly threat to the wildlife.
Đây là cái chốt của cái bẫy của này. Khi chốt xuống thì con thú nó sẽ bước vào trong cái lồng bẫy này. Đặc biệt cái bẫy cần này là khi con thú đi ngang qua nó bật rất mạnh, ít khi mà con thú nó thoát được lắm.
Representatives of Cát National Park Ranger Department noted that since 2017, they have removed nearly 30,000 traps of all kinds. However, the most concerning issue is the use of guns in hunting.
Trong những năm gần đây, thì tình trạng sử dụng súng tự chế là có cái chiều hướng tăng. Thì đây là một cái áp lực rất lớn đối với công tác quản lý bảo vệ rừng của vườn.
Long believes that as long as the demand persists, there will be supply. To reduce and eliminate the issue of illegal hunting and trading of wild animals in Vietnam, the only way is to not eat, consume wildlife products, or facilitate the trade of wildlife.
Ben, what needs to be done to improve the law enforcement in Vietnam in terms of wildlife protection?
Yeah, I think it has to happen across the entire supply chain of wildlife. If we're looking at domestic wildlife trade, that is. So one of the most fundamental issues that we have, WWF working with protected area managers on the ground, right, and with communities on the ground, is the large number of snares that are found on the forest floor. A recent report conducted by WWF suggests that there's 12 million snares at any one time just inside the protected areas of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. So getting on top of the snaring issue is, I think, one of the fundamentals from the supply side of the wildlife chain that we need to get on top of it. And there's a number of ways that we can do that. Part of it is getting protected area managers and rangers to include snare removal as part of their daily duties, to be out in the forest collecting, removing these traps so wildlife doesn't walk into them. Right. But there's all of these other issues as well that Ha's been talking about further up the supply chain. So, you know, we need to work with local communities. We need to support local communities to move into other occupations. Providing additional training, vocational training, is one way that we can try and reduce the number of snares that are in the forest, as well as the number of people who are involved in hunting. And then sort of moving further up the chain, who's selling the wildlife? Where are the outlets? You know, in the markets, in the pet stores, in the traditional medicine stores.
Or on the internet.
Or on the internet, more and more so. These people are actually then selling to the consumer, direct to the consumer, need to be identified. And again, law enforcement action needs to be taken very seriously to clamp down on these whole supply chains.
With an area of nearly 95,000 hectares, Pumat is the third largest of the legally defined special use forests in Vietnam. However, there are only around 60 forest rangers working here. That means each person is in charge of protecting more than 1,300 hectares of forest, an overwhelming amount of work. Therefore, many forms of modern technology have been applied to make the management work for forest rangers easier, one of which is an animal tracker. A monitoring device is attached to the pangolin before it's released back into the forest. The drone device attached to the receiver will capture the signal emitted from the chip to track down the location of the pangolin. Through this method, people can learn about the new life of the pangolin.
Bộ thiết bị mà chúng tôi đang sử dụng để theo dõi động vật tái thả như tê tê và rùa ấy, thì là cái bộ thiết bị này thì lần đầu tiên được sử dụng trên những cái loài động vật như tê tê, và cái công nghệ này thì cũng lần đầu tiên được sử dụng bên ngoài nước Úc và lần đầu tiên được triển khai ở Việt Nam. Vườn quốc gia Pumat cũng là nơi đầu tiên mà chúng tôi triển khai cái hoạt động giám sát theo cái công nghệ mới này.
Not only this, but another modern device is being mounted in many places in the forest. camera traps. At one point, Pumat had 200 camera traps like this. The images obtained provide information about the animal population and species currently in the forest.
Trong số hơn 100 cái máy bẫy ảnh của chúng tôi đặt thì có 10% là tương đương của hơn 10 cái là ghi nhận được loài TT ở ngoài tự nhiên. Bên cạnh đó nữa thì hiện nay trong quá trình mà chúng tôi tăng cường công tác bảo vệ, rồi tăng cường công tác tuần tra và thực hiện cái hoạt động giám sát, thì như vậy là các loài động vật hoang dã được thả lại thì phát triển tương đối tốt. Và chính vì vậy thì Pumat cũng là nơi được tin tưởng để cho các cái trung tâm bảo tồn, trung tâm cứu hộ ở trên cả nước là tiến hành thực hiện cái hoạt động tái thả ở đây.
These state-of-the-art pieces of equipment are all being used for the first time in Vietnam, but have yielded surprising results for forest rangers here, as they have recorded the new life of wild animals after being released into the forest. This has made the conservation work of Pumat National Park more feasible.
What are your comments on the application of technology in wildlife protection and conservation efforts?
I think it's really important because technology is now a part of our life, and we should use it like we use it in every walk of life. So we should also use it in wildlife conservation, like what Safe Vietnam Wildlife have done in Pumat. But it can also help address the more other issues, like having the other technology company like Facebook, Google, and other online platforms such as Shopee, Lazada, other platforms to be with us and to use technology to find those people that advertise wildlife for sale and to support law enforcement in tackling those wildlife crimes.
We at WWF, we have an extensive camera trapping program in place. So yeah, this is putting cameras in the forest and they detect movement and take photos. It's far more efficient than having people out in the forest trying to find this wildlife, which is often very, very difficult to find. And this is an incredibly important tool for us to understand what's happening in the forest and to understand whether all of these other interventions that we're doing are having an impact on the wildlife in the forest.
So what should each and every one of us do to help put an end to wildlife trafficking and prevent new epidemics like COVID-19?
I think like many people, like when they think like, wow, if I need to stop the wildlife trafficking, it's just like too much for me. It's like somebody else, like it needs like central government's like involvement in order to do that. But they don't know that like just small actions like count. So if they do something, they can actually have that huge impact.
A very clear message. What about you, Ben?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Haas said. I mean, as I said earlier, some of the inspirational stories that I've seen or people who've inspired me, they can be just everyday people, who have a passion and a belief that, wildlife deserves to exist in the wild. And so that's talking to your friends, it's working through your social media, to spread a message that, that the wildlife trade, wildlife consumption is not acceptable. It's just culturally, socially not acceptable. And like many of these social issues, if you see something, you have to say something, right? It really is as simple as that. And until we have that social movement, it will be quite difficult to have success. So it really does come from the grassroots level and everyday people, I think.
Well, thank you so much for your sharing today. We've learned so much. And for our audience out there, we should feel proud because the natural habitats of Vietnam are so diverse and rich that it makes it a perfect place for new species or those once thought to have gone extinct to live in. But in order to remain that pride, we must act to preserve it. The root cause of our unreasonable exploitation of the wildlife comes from our unreasonable demand and wrong belief in the magical effects of some wildlife products. The only way to change things is to change our mindset and relationship with nature. You might question, what if your action doesn't count? It does, because the shift in your mindset can affect your family members and relatives, and it will create a network of change. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time.